Hi everyone. So this is our third and final lesson for day one, specialized cells and tissues. So again, I just want to do a quick recap, make sure everybody is following along and doing what they need to do. So at this point, you should have finished from lesson one, a quiz on organelles. From lesson two, you should have finished your assignment on organelle analogies. You should also have completed your glossary, and then at the end of this part 3, you'll have completed that glossary in full, which I highly recommend that you do because you have a test at the end of part 3, and it would be kind of nice if you could use the glossary on the test. And you should have completed some practice questions from a textbook to practice with the ideas that you have learned. Okay, so in this lesson 3, after this video, there is a worksheet for you to try out with a couple of practice questions, which we have here. And then you'll move on to the end of unit test. And that's it. Then you'll be done for today. Okay, so lesson 3, here we go. Specialized cells and tissues. Learning goals. We're going to talk about how cells specialize. And we're going to talk about how different types of animal and plant tissue function. So what do different types of animal and plant tissue do? What's their job? All right, so to introduce ourselves to the idea of tissues, I want to tell you kind of just briefly what I know about this old sort of mythical legend from the secret history of the Mongols. So this is a mythical Mongolian heroine named, I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, but I'll do my best, something like Alangua. And she would have been an ancestor of Genghis Khan. But in any case, there's a story about she has 5 sons, and without getting into too much detail, there's a dispute between them. So she's worried that these 5 sons could turn on each other and harm each other. So what she does is, to teach them a lesson, she brings them some arrows, like from a bow and arrow, and she gives each one of them an arrow and tells them to break it. So they have 1 arrow in their hand, they snap it very easily. Then she gives them 5 arrows all bundled together and says, break that. And then just having 5 arrows stuck together, even though 5 people could, if they were each given 1 arrow, could break them, if you put 5 arrows together, then none of them could break the 5 arrows. So the idea is supposed to be that there's strength in unity. If the 5 of you stick together, then no one will be able to break you. So don't spend your time fighting each other, right? So this is kind of the way you can look at cells and tissues, right? So you can think of a single cell as being a little bit like a single arrow, and a bunch of cells together as being like this group of arrows. So if you take a bunch of cells and you put them together, they become much more capable than if you have them individually. And that's what a tissue is. So a tissue is a group of structurally and functionally similar cells joining together to perform a function. And also with that is something called an extracellular matrix, which we're going to worry about a little bit later. So here we have some examples of tissue types that we find in animal cells. Sorry, not animal cells, animals. So these are groups of cells working together. So what do we mean by structurally and functionally similar? What is that supposed to mean? Well, let's first talk about how you even get to this point. And to do that, you need to have specialized cells. So let's see if you can think of specialized cells. You probably know a few of them already. So before we move on, what cell types can you name? Can you think of any special cells that have special functions? Maybe even some of the ones that we had on our previous PowerPoints. Okay, here we go. These are just a small number of examples, right? But you can have muscle cells, fat cells for fat deposit storage, bone cells, red blood cells, immune cells. There's a whole host of these. Nervous cells. So this would be a neuron for sending electrical messages. Epithelial cells, which we'll worry about a little bit, and our sex cells, right? So all these cells look very different from each other. They're all specialized to do certain jobs, and they come from this thing in here called a stem cell. Okay, so how do we get specialized cells? Well, shortly after fertilization, human cells divide to form an embryo. So when the sperm meets the egg, the nuclei of those 2 cells fuse, and eventually you start getting cell division. And you get to eventually a point where you have a ball of cells. And so none of these cells are blood cells or epithelial cells or fat cells or anything at this point. All these cells look pretty much the same. So what are these cells? Well, these are stem cells, and that's where all of the other types of cells in our body are going to come from. So how do we get from just a few identical cells to trillions of cells that are all highly specialized, or at least many of them are highly specialized? Okay, well, it has to do with the stem cells. So stem cells have a property. We say that these stem cells are what we call totipotent. And what that means is they can kind of become any kind of cell. So stem cells can become skin cells. They can become white blood cells, right? The immune cells. They can become sex cells. They can become all different kinds of cells. So what's going on there? Well, remember we said the nucleus of a cell contains its DNA, which are the instructions needed to build and run the cell. And it turns out that if you're looking at our body cells, meaning non-sex cells, right, not sperm and egg, we're looking at other things, right, skin cells, blood cells, epithelial cells, so cells in the linings of our stomach and other such things, they all have the same DNA. So how is it that they're able to look and function so much differently if they all have the same DNA? Well, the thing is they don't all use the same parts of their DNA. So once you have a cell go from a sort of totipotent state into a specialized cell, what happens is the sections of DNA that code for things that the cell is not using. So for example, if you're going to make a skin cell, then some of the sections of the DNA that would code for things that are needed in a blood cell, those sections end up being sealed off. Basically, that DNA is rendered unusable, and so the cell is never able to use that part of the DNA, which means that that cell is no longer able to go down that path. So you can go from a stem cell to any other type of cell, but at least right now, it's very difficult to go from any other type of cell to something else, right? So you can go from a stem cell to a nerve cell, but it's very difficult to go from a skin cell to a nerve cell. Specialization happens, right? And so just to kind of emphasize and try to help you a little bit more with some terminology here, remember that when we say that the DNA tells a cell how to build something, that a section of DNA that does that is called a gene. So if you are still a little bit confused to the difference between genes and DNA, think about it this way. Imagine that you have the instructions to build an object like a chair, right? So somebody gives you the instructions to build a chair. The genes would be the actual instructions. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do that. Step 3, do that. Those are genes. They're specific instructions telling you to do something. But the language that those instructions are written in is the DNA. The actual code itself that produces the instructions is the DNA. So that would be like the language that's used, whatever the language of your instruction is. Okay, so the language of the instructions, the letters or characters that are used would be your DNA, and the actual instructions that they make up would be the genes, so to speak. Okay, so as we said, only some genes are expressed, meaning only some genes are used in any given cell at any given time. So when a cell specializes, like we said, genes become permanently switched off and they can't be used again, at least not normally. And that means the identity of the cell becomes fixed. So if it's a nerve cell, it stays a nerve cell. Now, even though we call these cells specialized, we don't say that these cells specialize from a stem cell into a liver cell. We say that they differentiate. So this process of going from a stem cell to a cell that has a specific kind of function, we call that differentiation. Okay, so like we said, it's usually impossible for a liver cell to use genes that you would find, say, in an intestinal cell, or even genes that you might find used in a stem cell, right? Once a cell specializes, many of its genes turn off. But like we said, cells can become damaged, right? The genes, the DNA, the code can become disrupted and say something different than what it's supposed to say. And so it turns out that it's possible for a liver cell to, if it has one of these mutations, turn on genes that do other things. And this is also sort of where cancer can come from, because you might say, well, why would these liver cells, have genes that would cause them to divide like crazy? Like, why would a liver cell want to do that? Well, maybe a liver cell wouldn't want to do that, but the stem cell that it came from would, and those genes get turned off in that stem cell, but then if they get turned on by mistake, then this kind of problem can start to happen. So specialized cells, basically they're permanently fixed when they change from a stem cell to that cell. They're permanently fixed unless something goes wrong. And then when that thing goes wrong, you end up with probably harmful consequences, right? So yes, it's kind of exciting, this whole idea that maybe you could take, say, another type of cell and change it into another type of cell, and then maybe if somebody, for example, was paralyzed, maybe you could treat them so that they could walk again. That's all really interesting and really exciting. But we got to be careful with this stuff, because in the process, you could trigger a disease, right? You could trigger cancer or something like that, and cause more harm than good. So this just kind of goes to show you, right? It's not as simple as this thing is cool, let's try it in science. You really got to be careful, because it's always possible that somebody could be harmed in a way that you wouldn't expect. Okay, so what is a tissue? So like we said, it's a group of structurally and functionally similar cells that join together to perform a function, right? So you're having multiple cells being better than one cell. And they also have with them an extracellular matrix. So extra means outside, so extracellular matrix, outside the cell. So what essentially this is, you can kind of see evidence of it here, if you imagine these pink things to be cells, that there are things in between the cells. So there's sort of like a material that all of these cells sit in, and that's the extracellular matrix. So where does this come from? Well, usually this matrix is actually made by the cells themselves, right? Remember what we were saying about how you can have organelles work together to export proteins? Well, some of the things that a cell is exporting, whether they be proteins or sugars or fats or other things, some of those things will stick around, kind of around the cell, and form an environment that will help the cell do its job. So for example, if you're to look at bone, you do have bone cells, right? There are things called osteoblasts. There are bone cells. But if you look at bone, it's not just made of cells. It's made of really hard material that those bone cells release outside of those cells. So you have those cells embedded in that hard material, and we call that material the extracellular matrix. Okay, so there are 4 types of animal cell tissue, and we're going to go over them. So we'll start with nervous tissue. So hopefully you're kind of aware of what nervous tissue does, right? This is where you send messages from one part of the body to another. And this is sort of the fast message system in your body. We have slower message systems in our body with chemicals called hormones. But for the fast messages, if you want reflexes and that kind of thing, you're looking at these things. You're looking at neurons and the cells that support them. So this is nervous tissue. And so you'll have neurons and supporting cells that make up that tissue. The supporting cells can be glial cells, like these cells here. And those cells support and feed the neurons to keep them going. But the neuron sends electrical signals from the dendrites to the axons. Don't worry about those words. So an electrical signal needs to pass through here. And so in order for this signal to pass effectively, there needs to be insulation around this region, basically to keep the charge difference, if you like, inside well, we call it the axon, but this region of the cell. So you have Schwann cells, which are specialized type of cells that surround the tail of this neuron, the axon, and they allow the message to pass through here easily. This is important, right? There are some diseases where these cells here kind of get damaged and the message doesn't pass as effectively. And people that have those diseases might have problems moving, for example. So you have, within this nervous tissue, you have the cell that sends the messages and the cells that support them by feeding them or by insulating their messages, making them more reliable. All right, we also have muscle tissue. So this is made up of fibers that can expand and contract to facilitate movement. You don't have to worry about the names of these fibers or anything like that. But essentially what they can do is they can get longer and they can get shorter. So if you imagine, if you're holding onto something and you shorten your arm, right, you pull it towards you. So you can kind of push and pull with muscle. Okay, so you have a few different types of muscle. You have skeletal muscle, which is attached to your bone via tendons, right? So you have muscles attached to tendons, attached to bone. So these skeletal muscles can pull on your bones and get them to move. So these are responsible for most of the voluntary movements that you do, right? If you raise your arm, if you are talking, any of this kind of stuff where you're moving bone, you're using your skeletal muscles to do it. We also have smooth muscles, which are generally involuntary, meaning that they're not under your control, but they do provide important movement functions in our body. So an example of these would be the muscle movements that push the food through your digestive system, right? Once you swallow your food, even for part of the process while you're swallowing your food, once it gets sort of past your mouth, you can't control what happens to it. But it doesn't just kind of randomly sit there. Your body does push it along. We have these pushes called peristalsis, where smooth muscle is kind of making the pathways in your body bigger or smaller and kind of squeezing the food and pushing it through. So we have that kind of squeeze pushing through food through our digestive system, and that squeeze can expand or contract our blood vessels. So you might notice, for example, if you are cold, that the blood vessels kind of sort of shrink, or they appear to shrink. The blood vessels will contract to try to keep the blood near the core of your body to keep it warm, because if it moves out towards the extremities, it's easier for heat to be lost there. Or if you're hot, the same sort of thing. If you're hot and you're sweating, you might notice the expansion of some of your blood vessels because they're trying to release heat. So this contracting and expansion of your blood vessels is controlled by smooth muscle that surrounds them. Okay, what else? We have cardiac muscle tissue. So like smooth muscle, this is involuntary, but it's a little bit different because what's different about it is that it's capable of acting independently of the brain. So your cardiac muscle is what we call myogenic. It can kind of generate its own impulses that control it. It can operate on its own. And these are the muscles responsible for causing your heart to beat. Now your brain can kind of play with this a little bit by sending messages to tell your heart's beat to speed up or to kind of not speed up. So basically, I guess, slow down from where it was. But the actual beat itself can be generated just from muscles. So it's kind of scary. I don't know. It's a really old movie. If anyone's seen Indiana Jones, where the guy's heart gets pulled out of his body and it's still beating, technically that would be possible. Maybe not quite like they show it, but it's possible for a heart to beat out of a body independently of a brain, at least for a while. Okay, epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue lines and protects surfaces. So you can think of your skin. If you want to think of the inside of your body, think about the digestive tract, right? The part that the food actually contacts as it's moving through will be epithelial tissue. The smooth muscle tissue that pushes the food through your digestive tract will not actually be contacting the food. It will be underneath the epithelial tissue. So these tissues line surfaces both inside and outside of your body. We have a few different types here. I'm not going to expect you to know these. Okay, and last but not least for animal tissues, we have connective tissue. You can think of this as kind of like being the rest. So these are tissues that make up the form of the body. So they help your body keep its shape. They keep everything where it's supposed to go so that you don't have other types of tissue in your body randomly falling over each other. You don't have organs falling out of place. So they keep your body shaped. They keep everything in form. And so these are tissues like your bone, right, that keep your body standing upright. Your cartilage in your nose, for example, it's a little bit more flexible in bone, but it's still pretty hard. It keeps shape. Your ligaments and tendons, and even your blood. So blood itself is considered to be a type of connective tissue. So typically, I guess if it's not a cell that's by itself, if you're looking at nervous, muscle, and epithelial, and it's not any one of those, then it's probably this one, because you have quite a variety of connective tissue. Okay, so that's it for animal tissues, right? Just remember the different types, the 4 different types. So you got nervous, you got muscle, you got epithelial, you got connective. We're going to learn about 4 different types of plant tissues now, and that's going to wrap up our unit. So the 4 types are listed here. You've got meristematic, dermal, and ground, and vascular tissue. And the xylem and phloem are special types of vascular tissue. So meristematic tissues. you can kind of think of these as almost like the stem cells in plants. These are going to be the cells that divide to get the plant to grow, and they can also differentiate, so they can also become the other types of tissues. So they exist typically in plants in regions called meristems, and these are regions of growth. So they will happen near the tip of a root. If a root is growing underground and trying to expand and get larger, then its meristems will be where the cell division is happening. If a plant's trying to get taller, then you'll have stems, and you have meristems on the stems as well. Okay, so this is where, as we said, cells divide, so the plant is able to get longer, and in doing so, the cells eventually differentiate to take on important roles. We're not going to worry too much about where that happens in this picture. Okay, so what are the different cell types, or tissue types rather, that can be formed from meristematic tissue? Well, one of them would be dermal tissue. So this is kind of like your epithelial tissue but for plants. So these are the tissues that line and protect the rest of the plant. So you can think of like the outer surface of a leaf. And what you might notice is that there's a waxy cuticle on top of a leaf, right? It's sort of like a waxy material, meaning it's not, you could say it's kind of like oily, but it's maybe a little bit more solid than oil. But it's similar to oil in that it's hydrophobic. It repels water. And that's really important because it's going to prevent the leaf from losing water. So epithelial tissues line and protect the plant, and one of the things they protect the plant from is water loss. Okay, so if you think of the dermal tissue as the outside of the plant that protects it, the vascular tissue is the part that's way on the inside. And you can think of these as almost like the blood vessels of the plant. So these are going to be what transports liquid and fluids around the plant. So what kinds of things get transported? Well, water is going to be very important, but another thing that gets transported is sugar. So xylem typically transports water. There are some exceptions where you can find sugar in the xylem. One important one here in Canada is in maple trees when you produce maple syrup. Phloem, though, is normally where the sugar is actually transported. So you can think of, generally speaking, xylem transports water, phloem transports sugar. Okay, both of these tissue types both of these are considered vascular tissue, and they exist in vascular bundles. So if you look at these circular regions here, they're all vascular bundles that contain some xylem and some phloem. We're not going to worry about monocot and dicot just yet. Last but not least, we've got ground tissue. So you've got dermal tissue, which is on the outside, vascular tissue, which is on the inside. The rest of it is this stuff, ground tissue. And again, I'm not going to ask you about different types. They actually don't even have the names for the different types here, so don't worry about it. Just worry about generally what ground tissue does. So what is ground tissue? It's the filler, right? It's the material that fits in between the vascular tissue and the dermal tissue. It's what makes your plant solid. And so it's important in maintaining the structure of the plant so that it's not hollow inside, so that it's strong to stand up. But it also has other roles as well. So some of these cells can do photosynthesis, and some of them are able to store material. So basically think about it as structural support, storage, and photosynthesis. And that's it. Okay, so we've covered all the tissue types. Please make sure that you have these filled in your glossary. Make sure that you complete those practice questions on the worksheet, and that you ask me anything if you're not sure, if you don't understand. Please join my office hours or send me an email. And then when you're ready, take your glossary, have it beside you, and you can write your test. And good luck. All right, that's it for lesson 3 and for our first day. Enjoy the rest of your day.